Today, you are Gerald Ford. You're President of the United States. It's the summer of 1974, and you have a big decision to make. A little bit of background. You haven't been president for long, just a matter of weeks, in fact. You were vice president, and you became president upon the resignation of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was getting engulfed in the Watergate scandal, and he resigned his office, it seemed, just sort of one step ahead of impeachment. He leaves the office to you, and you never expected that you would be President of the United States. You had been a solid member of Congress from your home state of Michigan, and you were considered to be someone who was steady, unspectacular, not particularly brilliant. You were a good college athlete, which is, you played football at the University of Michigan, which had prompted Lyndon Johnson to say of Jerry Ford, you know, good guy, but he played too many football games without his helmet on. So it's, the impression of Jerry Ford is that he's a good guy, he's a steady guy, and that's about it. But now you're President of the United States. How did you get there? Well, you got there by a unique path. Because unlike previous vice presidents who became president, you were not elected. You weren't part of the ticket that got elected. You became president following the resignation of Richard Nixon's elected vice president, Spiro Agnew, who had to resign amid a scandal of his own. And you were appointed. And so you don't even have the legitimacy of having been elected on the same ticket as your president. Accidental presidents, these vice presidents who become president, at least they can claim, most of them can claim, well, at least I was on the ticket and people knew that one day I could become president, so they kept that in mind when they voted. Not in your case, so you're unusual in this regard. And so now you're president, you have almost no legitimacy as president. As I say, you've got a solid reputation as a member of Congress. But beyond that, you can't say that, you don't have any mandate from the people. You are a Republican, and as a Republican, you would like to see the Republican Party do well in the upcoming congressional elections. This is 1974. And in the presidential election in 1976, you could imagine that, well, you could get elected in your own right. And then all of the questions about how you got here, those would be erased, because now you'd be elected in your own right. But you have this decision to make, and the decision has to do with your predecessor. Richard Nixon is out of office. He can no longer be impeached, but he might very well be indicted for criminal conspiracy or criminal activities in the obstruction of justice surrounding the Watergate scandal. And so you have to decide what to do. You could simply do nothing. That would be entirely within your prerogative. And you could let the wheels of justice do what the wheels of justice do. Now you feel that if you do nothing and you let a potential prosecution, an indictment, a trial play out, that it could go on for a long time. And the country needs to regain its focus. It has lost its focus amid, in sort of quick succession, the Watergate scandal, then the American defeat in Vietnam. There are going to be decisions that are going to have to be made, and you're the one who's going to have to make them. So, can you make these decisions if the attention of the country is focused on your predecessor and on the criminal trial of Richard Nixon? You think maybe not. It is suggested to you that, the smart thing to do, Mr. President Ford, is simply to pardon Richard Nixon. Pardon Richard Nixon, then you take all of this off the table. Now, if you do, so the upside of this is you pardon Nixon and this Watergate scandal, this whole business is behind you, is behind the country. And you think that this is necessary, at least you think there's a good argument that this might be necessary. Now, the downside of this is that people quite likely will conclude, some people will likely conclude, now wait a minute. So Ford was vice president, and Nixon is thinking about resigning or trying to fight it out by staying in office. So, and so then he decides to resign, and he hasn't said exactly why, but he resigns, and then just weeks later, he's pardoned. Boy, if that doesn't sound like a sweetheart deal. You know, Mr. Ford, Mr. President, if you pardon Nixon, people are going to think that this was a shady deal. It was cooked up in the Oval Office one day when nobody was looking, and that you agreed ahead of time to pardon Richard Nixon so you could be president. He'd get off, he wouldn't have to go to prison, and you could become president of the United States. What a deal is this? So, Mr. Ford, you're the one who has to decide. What are you going to do? Now, I have to step out of character here for a moment and speak as the historian, because I have every reason to believe that there was no formal arrangement between Nixon and Ford about this. I would be very surprised, knowing what I have learned about Gerald Ford over the years, if he had done something like this. It was not in character. And in fact, it probably wouldn't have even been in Nixon's character to work this kind of thing out formally, explicitly ahead of time. Although it's a little bit difficult to say things with any confidence about Nixon's character. He was at times a very shady character. But anyway, so we'll assume for the sake of this argument that you didn't make this deal with Nixon ahead of time. But you're aware that people will think you did if you pardon Richard Nixon. Anyway, so this is the deal. Do you pardon Nixon, or do you simply let justice play out? It's up to you. Well, as usual, I will tell you what, in this case, Gerald Ford did. He pardoned Richard Nixon. And in fact, that short-circuited any prosecution. It was a little bit weird because pardons typically are given after somebody has been convicted. And after they've been convicted, typically they have to sort of acknowledge wrongdoing, and then you pardon them. Okay, you did it, and you know it was wrong, you broke the law, but now you're pardoned because there are extenuating circumstances. Now this didn't happen in this case. This was a preemptive pardon. And it was a little bit unclear what status this preemptive pardon had. But it did suffice to stop any prosecution of Nixon. Nixon went into retirement, and he sort of faded from public view. As for you, well, you did run for election in your own right in 1976, and you lost. You lost a close race. Now, there's no telling for certain whether you would have won if you had not pardoned Nixon. It was a bad time, 1976, to be a Republican incumbent because, well, by this time, the war in Vietnam had ended badly for the United States, an American defeat. And Richard Nixon, this is the one everybody was remembering. The Democrats didn't bother running against you in 1976. They ran against Richard Nixon. And he's the guy who had to flee ahead of the Watergate posse. And to the extent that you were involved in that, well, you could be tagged with a certain kind of complicity. And at least this was the argument made. And, you couldn't defend yourself any more than saying, no, I didn't do it. But of course, if you did it, that's exactly what you would have said. So here's the thing. You did what you thought was right for the country. Because there's no other reason, really, for pardoning Richard Nixon. Let's assume, again, that there wasn't this sweetheart deal ahead of time. You think that this is good for the country. The country needs to move on. And what happens? Well, I can't say for certain that it cost you victory in the 1976 election, but it certainly didn't make that victory any easier. You ended up losing a close race. It could have made the difference. So this is maybe what doing the right thing in your mind, Gerald Ford, winds up costing you. Is it a price you were willing to pay? I think in your conscience, I guess so. Probably. You seem like a decent guy.